You know, he's really he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, a moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
This is a bit of a loosey-goosey one. We don't have a book or anything, but I kind of wanted to do this episode because the film adaptation for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was released recently. Have either of you seen it?
No.
I didn't even know there was a film adaptation.
Yeah. Someone made a film of it. And so this is probably my favorite narrative poem, and it's definitely sort of my favorite medieval text. And I got introduced to it, I think, when I took a medieval literature seminar, which was really fun. And I actually learned to read the thing, at least the first part, in Middle English. So that was cool. But so it got me thinking of authorship in particular, because no one really knows who the author of this poem is. And one of the reasons that no one knows the author is that authorship just wasn't really that important back in the, what was it? I think it's 13th, 14th century. I can't remember. Mm-hmm. So I thought it would be an interesting kind of jumping off point to talk about anonymous authors and anonymity and writing, and also relating that to the internet, because that's a really kind of, I guess, interesting topic. But of course, with Gawain and the Green Knight, there are sort of educated guesses. There's like a whole cottage industry of people trying to work out who the author is. He's probably a man, probably in the clergy, because they were educated enough to write this shit down. But other than that, the text obviously lists no author, because because this is pre-Gutenberg, and particularly pre-professionalization of writers or authors. No one really owned a story, which is something I think we can forget. But it almost seems, one of the reasons why I think it's interesting to talk about is that idea is almost coming around again with the internet age and everything.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just to start with, long live copyright and private property rights. Am I right, boys? Capitalism all the way down.
Yeah. Well, definitely with intellectual property, I'm like, get rid of this Creative Commons bullshit. I don't want it. Well, people can do it, but I'm not interested.
No, the best thing, in academia is to make sure that you pay for your own open access articles on top of whatever else you don't get paid as well. Just pay for your articles to be on open access. So no one can read them openly. Yeah. I was trying to think, when you mentioned we're going to do this, I was trying to think of what my actual favorite anonymous poem or work is. And I guess there's you had two divides between anonymous poems from that kind of era before there was too much emphasis on authorship and that sort of stuff. And then there's the more contemporary anonymous works from people I guess, who just have remained outside of the public eye. Even today, I guess Elena Ferrante is probably the most well-known one today. And of course, every time you get an anonymous writer, you get the big cottage industry of trying to figure out who it is.
Did someone do Ferrante? Did they get someone actually did that, right?
What's the guy's name? Dominic Salvatore or something like that. I can't remember.
And it is a guy, right?
Yeah, well, supposedly. Yeah. Which is very, very humorous in so many ways. But I Pynchon's probably he's not really anonymous, is he? But the cottage industry around trying to figure out who Pynchon actually is the Unabomber, or somehow they thought he was they thought he must have been Salinger as well. That was pretty good. But I know I always like the anonymous poem from 1610 or something like that, or maybe it's late 16th century. The Roaring Mad Tom song by Anonymous.
I don't think I've heard that one.
You probably have. It's some people would just want to assume that it's Shakespeare wrote it, but no one actually knows. But yeah, it's just sort of about it's in that classical sort of mode of mad songs, something that's been in Bedlam or whatever, and it's been sort of raving mad, and just singing stuff. I love that poem. I can give a rendition of it if you would like.
Ooh, that'd be cute.
Okay.
I want to hear you. I want to hear you sing.
It's not a sing. I'm not going to sing it.
I want to hear you iambic pentameter.
I won't read the whole thing. I'll read the best parts of it. Where are we? This is like closer to the end. I know more than Apollo, for oft when he lies sleeping, I see the stars at mortal wars and the wounded welkin weeping. The moon embrace her shepherd and the queen of love her warrior, while the first doth horn the star of morn and the next the heavenly farrier. While I do sing, any food, any feeding, drink or clothing, come dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. The gypsies, Snap and Pedro, are none of Tom's camarados. The punk I scorn, and the cut purse sworn, and the roaring boys bravados. The meek, the white, the gentle, me handle nor spare not. But those that cross Tom Rhinoceros do what the panther dare not. Although I sing any feeding, drink or clothing, come dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. And this is the best final stanza. With an host of furious fancies whereof I am commander, with a burning spear and a horse of air to the wilderness I wander. By a night of ghosts and shadows I summon damned to tourney, 10 leagues beyond the wide world's end. Methinks it is no journey, yet I will sing any food, any feeding, drink or clothing, come dame or maid, be not afraid, or Tom will injure nothing.
It's cute. I love that. Yay. It actually does. It does sort of sound like Shakespeare too. I can get why people got that sort of je ne sais quoi that Shakespeare's.
I think it's also like because of like how good it is as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think people just sort of assume that we may as well just give it to Shakespeare anyway.
Well,
I mean,
we all know Shakespeare's an invention, so it's not
exactly.
a real person.
I saw the movie Anonymous. I know what's going on here. Shakespeare is fake.
My
a lower class peasant couldn't have done all that.
Wasn't there was a recent article in the Atlantic or something that a friend sent me, which I somehow missed, trying to say that it was actually like an Italian woman. I can't remember like who that was trying to say it was. But my favorite rebuttal to like all of this was, I think Harold Bloom once was like writing about different like theories. It was like, okay, well actually the best theory we can possibly have is that it must be the like Lucy Negro, the Dark Lady of the Sonnets, because at least we know that Shakespeare slept with him, slept with her. So unlike Francis Bacon, if Francis Bacon had slept with Shakespeare, then maybe it would be a better idea.
I support the Francis Bacon ex Shakespeare ship. It happened. It's real. You can't tell me it's not.
Yeah, well, Queen Victoria also wrote all of Lewis Carroll, so
I think my favorite anonymous piece of fiction is My Immortal. I think XXX Bloody Wrists 666 XXX is a scribe around time. Raven Darkway is the top 10 protagonist in fiction. Yeah, that's my bit. It is interesting how anonymity plays much more part of our life than I think we do. It's interesting because you read an online article and you don't look you're not looking up the writer. It could be anybody.
we do now.
Huh?
We do now.
We do now. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, unless you want to drag them on social media or something, so you look up their account.
Don't worry. Whenever someone posts anything on Facebook, I look up their LinkedIn. I inform their workers. I inform everyone. No one gets away from my RAF.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the cottage industry of trying to find who they are, which I guess that kind of contemporary anonymity, it's almost like a baked-in part of it. Part of the reason why the publisher would want to publish that is because they know that they can drum up a lot of marketing. I like speaking of My Immortal, the idea that Vice published article and paid money to this woman who was a fake for this shitty fanfic that was written in 2006. People were obsessed with it for a year, and then I was like, oh no. Particularly in the internet age where there are a million bloody wrists 666. Although it's not anymore. Everything now has our real names attached to it. Like, technically, if you have your fake name attached to your Facebook account, they can suspend your account because you've breached their terms of service.
The cottage industry is like, I feel like the cottage industry is like just almost like just become academia in many ways. I mean, not like as bad as it could be, but just there's like always an obsession with trying to not even like just figure out, anonymous authors or whatever. It's not like that much of that, I guess, but it's more making sure, we must pinpoint every single thing in a worker's oeuvre back to something that happens in their biographical life. Even if it's like explicitly, is this character just like the narrator, or is this character's mother also the narrator's mother or whatever? But even just to the extent that there must be some sort of like psychological trauma that caused them to write in this way, and like all this sort of stuff, it just becomes like very, very boring.
There's also I want to get back to like the pre-Gutenberg, post-Gutenberg kind of thing, because I think it's interesting how texts and stuff before they could be mass distributed, mass produced. Like I said, stories weren't really owned by anyone. Like sometimes people wrote them down, with a few exceptions. Obviously, like we know who did like the Greek plays and shit like that. But like, so it became this, stories were just sort of distributed. Sometimes they were changed. Like Beowulf doesn't have an author. There are heaps of other examples as well. But once the kind of mass production and the ability to produce heaps and heaps of texts came out, not just heaps of texts, but lots of runs of those texts. Slowly, the author becomes way more important. I think that's an interesting paradox, because it's like there were fewer texts before that and people didn't give a shit about the author. Then there are massive amounts, like a glut of text, and the author becomes this, it's almost like the author becomes this way of organizing like the proliferation of stories or something.
Yeah. I mean, they become authorial. They're not just the writer; they're the author. Whereas, like before, it was there's the oral tradition of kind of storytelling graduated into authorial master of the text. We'll probably bring it later, but like Barth, the death of the author probably was seminal in that kind of idea of deconstructing the idea that the author is the master of the text, and getting back to that kind of pre-Gutenberg way of thinking about texts of like none of this is owned by anybody. We can chop and change it as it is, and just because that the first French dude in the 1500s who wrote down Cinderella, Charles Perrault or whatever, he is not the author of Cinderella. He's just is the author. He is the writer of the most kind of prolific version of that text. IP law. Wouldn't Disney love to have that?
Thank God for it. I don't know. I if you wanted to talk about Bart, it's an essay that I feel like is like so badly misinterpreted, like all the time.
Oh my God, so badly misinterpreted.
Like I feel like people who read it don't actually never have actually read it. So he doesn't actually say the author's dead for starter. I mean, he says that the it's sort of like he kind of does, but it's not really. Like the author doesn't in terms of when we're interpreting a text, is really sort of like being against people who are obsessed with like intentionality and what the author intends and stuff like that. And for him, it's really more of an argument against like God and theology and the idea of like teleological meaning. Like fair enough, but the author's like still exists. I think, as he says, like near the end of the essay, exists as a sort of like, it goes through like a haunting back over the text itself. So it's never actually fully dead, but is always sort of there as a haunting, which is a much far more interesting idea than any of the other interpretations of Bart.
I've written an essay on this in that about the misinterpretations of Barth's essay, which is it's
also a very good essay.
Oh, thank you. Is it my essay or Barth's essay?
Oh, your essay. Bart can go to hell.
Yeah. Essentially what he's saying, he's responding to a very specific way of reading text that was popular in France. So, which is where I think he talks about Valéry, Mallarmé, and what was the other one? Is it Celine? Someone like that. Balzac, maybe. And he's talking about how there's this whole cottage industry of like people reading into like their life story and like kind of interpreting their novels and stuff through that. But he's not saying that like the author doesn't matter, but what happened in like the 70s and 80s, like all these academics kind of took not just Barth's ideas, but like misinterpreted some Derridean ideas as well. And kind of suggested that it's like, oh, texts are just accidents. They just happen.
Yeah.
And my whole point is that that's not true. Texts are intentional objects. So like people want to remove intentionality from the process. They're taking what Barth's saying, misinterpreting it and taking it to like real extremes. Like that.
So you get the idea that, which I feel like this has sort of died now as an idea, but I guess it sort of still exists between that sort of like 80s, 90s period, where it's not the author doesn't speak, it's the language that speaks instead.
Yeah.
And that if you can separate language from authority or from the author, it somehow gives us more freedom, but also allows us to understand the ways in which discourse or systems of power speak through us and strip us of our autonomy or ability to act in the world.
Yeah.
Which is like that's a nihilistic idea if you've ever heard one, right? Which is not at all what I feel like sometimes it's not what Derrida is saying at all. It's maybe what Foucault is saying to a certain extent, but maybe not as well.
But he wouldn't he?
Foucault is interesting. As is always the case with like any of these like French theorists, they themselves are interesting. It's their malformations by usually literary critics who are always the worst and destroy them. In terms of them being any interesting. Yeah, well, this is
and that's the kind of popularization of this mode of thinking, particularly with Barth's idea of the death of the author, made out like you said, it's discourses that author the text rather than authors themselves.
Importantly, if you can change I think this is where becomes a sort of political idealism from it as well. And you get this obsession over language, because if language is the cause of things rather than people themselves, then if you change the language that people use, you also change their being as well. So that, you get this obsession over, well, if people are using bad words, if you just change them from using bad words or censor their bad words, you'll stop them from being bad people. Yeah. And like that kind of language. Or if you change the system, you change, like everything's malleable towards that system. You just change the system, then everything's fine, which is just not true.
Yeah.
Or not the case.
But this idea has metastasized, and it's like, this is why, and in the internet age as well, this is like what lots of debates over all sorts of shit is like. It's about words and meanings and what language this person's using in whatever capacity they are, as either an author or, to be current with discourse, a comedian, perhaps. Like the way that they author their texts becomes a question of, like, they remove the idea of intention from it. So, and focus more on, how could I possibly read into this, or read something nefarious or whatever. It becomes like, it almost becomes antithetical to whatever the author was intending. So you can have situations where a literally opposite meaning of what someone said or wrote becomes the kind of opinion on what the text is.
And words become more deliberately separated from context as well, or anything like that. I think comedians are actually a good example of this, because I feel like comedy in general is usually like a microcosm of how like all language, or how like all the sort of literature works, and the level of like discourse and the way that it proliferates through discourse. Because comedy, like so much of like comedy now, is that it's so meta. that it relies upon your own knowledge of certain tropes, your own knowledge upon certain like whatever, right? And that's usually comedy is like the manipulation of like already like preordained tropes. Like comedy is probably the most unoriginal of all genres, right? Like the same sort of, you see the same gags in Aristophanes as you see today, and what gives them sort of meaning is like through that proliferation of tradition, I guess. And to strip it from that context to be like, well, use X word, and X word means this in Y context. Therefore, that you should have been aware of like Y context, so why not? And that sort of stuff. And you can get slammed for that. But comedy itself is also quite anonymous, right? Who the hell, like the vast majority of like human jokes aren't authored by any individual person, but are like just things that get passed down through tradition that get like malformed in many different kinds of ways. And then we'll get like, I feel like you can't really own a joke, right? I don't think anyone really, you might own like comedy shows, or you might own like books, but you don't really own a joke in the same way that you can own like a poem or something like that. Comedy itself is kind of more free in that sense than literature is in terms of like publishing and stuff.
Oh yeah, and that's why you get comedians stealing each other's jokes all the time. Like,
and it's just sort of, it's expected, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's part of the joke.
I don't know if it's expected, but I mean, particularly in this age of like intense authorship, where everybody in the entire world is an author or constantly publishing texts, comedians being butthurt because someone stole a tweet or something is or their joke, because every comedian has their shows recorded. I think stealing comedy is far less common than what it was maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because you just can't anymore. People, and because like the comedy stands know every single, they know every single one of Norm Macdonald's jokes off by heart, and so you can't just be like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe is there a comedy?
Have you heard the gay son joke? That's my favorite. He's like, it's so stupid. Like, it has to be delivered by him because he's got a fun delivery. But basically, he's talking about a dad who's proud of his gay son, and then he goes around. The dad is like so proud that he goes around showing all his straight mates his son photos of his son sucking dicks. I'm just so proud of him.
What we'd all do for a dad like that. Really proud of me.
Oh dear. But yeah, this question of anonymity and the internet, I think, is really interesting because I think we mentioned this before, like that lots of really interesting kind of wordplay, sometimes even like books and shit, being published on Amazon and stuff by people who are essentially anonymous or pseudonym. How do you say that? Pseudonymous.
Pseudonymy.
We really shouldn't do like a kind of literary theory episode when we've been drinking.
What do you mean? They all wrote their theory when they were drunk.
Yeah, you can't actually. The more that you can actually pronounce the word, the less literary it is. It's how we weed out the weak from the strong.
Yeah. But so this idea of anonymity on the internet, like, I actually think it's it's still there. Like, you've got lots of people who are kind of internet writers and publishers and things like that who are either using a pseudonym, and it's always a stupid pseudonym, or like Bronze-Age Pervert or something like that. Like publishing, and not just people like that, but just publishing, even just posting and stuff like shit online and doing it behind an anonymous kind of account, which I think is interesting because it come back around again.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that authorship has receded in importance, or is something else happening there?
I think the early dream of the internet, like that common sort of joke that you don't know on the internet, you don't know if a person's real or a dog or something, whatever it is, right? But I feel like that's maybe like the early sort of dream of the internet, that you could be anonymous, and it's sort of like this completely free space where you can sort of do what you want and don't have to be yourself, right? Whereas today, I don't think it's the same anymore. I think it's partly because it's maybe become more the more that it became adopted by people, the less it was going to become like that, because when it becomes more of a synecdoche of just usual social life, it can't no longer be anonymous. Where it's like, if it's just like a bunch of like people on the internet on like weird forums who can go by whatever name they want, it's kind of it's a separate space from their social life. But with the advent of like Facebook and whatever, it becomes an extension of social life rather than a replacement. So I think that it just becomes more and more, you must be tied to your identity as well. And like, even the way that you can get like, you also pinpointed to your identity as well, like the way you can be pinpointed to like, for like IP addresses, the way that you can be, and the way that everyone is sort of tracked or enumerated by Google. You can't really escape that kind of economy either. And it's entirely like based upon yourself. So the way that, you know, Google's entire, the ingenuity of Google's like advertising algorithms is entirely that they can tell you, they know who you are better than you know yourself more often than not, and they can like sell you ads based upon that algorithm.
I'm kind of sus on that now though, because all the algorithms suggest to me are things that I've already bought, or they send me ads for my work, which I work at. It's like, come to this college, and I'm like, I work here.
It's better than half the ones I've been getting on Facebook recently, which for erectile dysfunction medication. So that's not good.
Wow.
Yeah,
you're too young to be getting those ads.
Exactly. It's not good. They're the only ones. It's like either them or like football ads or something like that. So it's a niche medium that I've got going for myself. But yeah, I feel like they're both the influence of Google's like advertising algorithms and the influence of algorithms as well is like, was one, it's like it's overstated by like a lot, and it's also kind of like understated. So there was a book recently by Shoshana Zuboff, called "The Age of Surveillance Capitalism," and some of the like there's like some good underlying arguments she has, but there's like a bunch of like her like overriding arguments, which are basically like Google just wants to have like almost like mind control over people, and wants to like, you know, wants to have a complete control of your identity, and it uses ads to achieve that. And I'm like, the vast majority, I don't think there are many people who are ever like really controlled that much by like ideology or that sort of thing. It seems like a really sort of like almost like paranoid Marxist type argument that again, this comes back to the fact that there's no human autonomy. We're entirely controlled by the systems that are in place. We can entirely be manipulated, and like I think that's true to a certain extent. But even if you go back to those the big sort of paranoia and scares around advertising back in the 90s, that I can't think of the term. Where basically everyone was like worried that, you know, if you have like certain kinds of ads on TV, it'll just completely control like the way you're going to act in the world and stuff. There's a term for it. That was the time. But, you know, it also relates back to the, you know, the idea that violent video games will make you violent in real life and that sort of stuff as well. And there's like a one-to-one causal link between these things. And it's not like, it's really not the case as much. But it's much more, I think it's much more interesting to think about it in terms of like identity issues that you must, there's almost like no escape from your identity either. There's no escape from your language or your statements. So it's almost like a hyper intentionality as well. That you, it's sort of weird in that you're right that at one point statements can be taken out of context and can be misread to what you didn't intend. But at the same time, you have to be entirely wary of the way that you write things, so that you do know, so that the intention is entirely apparent and that you don't get misread, so that you're entirely based now upon your intention and you can't escape it, which I think is not necessarily the best thing in the world. Yeah,
well, that's what there's a book I've recently read called You and Your Profile, or Your Profile and You. I can't remember which way it is, but they talk about that, and their concept that they talk about is two authors. The concept they talk about is they call it profilicity. So it's like you conceptualize yourself almost entirely through your profile. And they don't necessarily mean just online. They're talking about this kind of extends outside of the online space now as well. And the idea is that we can't just be ourselves. Like we are ourselves for an audience. So it's like a second order of like sense making. I forget the exact term. They use second order, but they say second order of signification or something like that. But that happens on your social media profile. And even when you're being very kind of open and honest, that too is a second order function, because it's like you're aware of being watched, or aware of being witnessed. It's not a paranoid thing. It's more of a like, this is just how it is.
If we use the Althusserian terms, it's
interpolation.
Interpolation, yeah, yes. Fuck.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting idea, and I think it goes to when you talk about anonymity as well, like how that functions as well, because even anonymous accounts do that, like that they're concerned with how they are viewed. Like there are less stakes for them, fewer stakes for them if they, say something controversial, unless someone doxes them or whatever, but they are still doing it for an audience, for how is my profile going to be perceived. So, and at that point, I think anonymity becomes not as meaningful as it used to be. Let's just say that, in terms of the way in which you speak truth to power or whatever. Because the idea behind being anonymous is that you can more easily tell the truth, right? But that is still mediated by this idea of profilicity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then the way that you because you're right that the fact that there's a general idea that you should be, the more anonymous you are, the more likely you are to tell the truth about something, right? Which is the entire basis about how we do surveys, right, or anonymous surveys and stuff. Thank God for that. But at the same time, there's an idea now that we must be like more, and this comes back to what we talked about a few weeks ago, in terms of sincerity and stuff. That you must now be sort of sincere and tell the truth. That you shouldn't, one, that you shouldn't lie, but also one that you shouldn't be flippant about certain things. That you shouldn't be sort of joking about certain things. That things get taken like almost like too seriously at the same time, which I think does relate back to anonymity. Isn't like the Cohen interview, Joshua Cohen interview. I think I sort of linked to you guys before. Like he's like one of the writers I think who cares like about this the most, in that he the idea that he has the idea that he has associated with literature in general is of the mask, is of anonymity, to be able to be a different self. And he sort of, I guess he takes us back to the sort of the Nietzschean idea about what metaphor is, and metaphor is the desire to be different, to not be literal, to be a different self, right? And in an age where you can't be anonymous, that gives you over to an age of like autofiction. It gives you over to an age where the I is the I, and the I is not other. Rombo is dead, basically. And I feel like in a very strange way, that's the legacy of Bart, which it should be the other way around. Like the legacy of Bart has actually been to re-entrench the author rather than to kill the author in a very strange way.
What's the only thing that a pirate's afraid of? The dark! I remember hearing that joke when I was 10 years old. I remember the guy I heard it from. His name was Herman Pollock. He was an older guy around the synagogue, and he had a lot of jokes. And a lot of them were about pirates. Why did the pirate quit his ship to write poetry? He did it for the love of the art! Anyway, this guy from the synagogue told these jokes to me, and they told them to me free of charge. And now NewsHour is paying me to tell them to you. How do I justify this? Do I owe Herman Pollock or his heirs a percentage of whatever I'm earning? A few years after I heard these jokes was the first time I went online, 1994. This was the first time online for a lot of people. In many ways, mine was a test generation. Everything was free for us, or felt free. We wanted some music, we downloaded it. We wanted to print out a photo and hang it on the wall. So what? We downloaded books or ebooks with a single click. We downloaded games. It all seemed like a game. There was so much to hear and see and read. We played around in the imagination of strangers. Or whoever it was who produced all this stuff. They weren't even strangers. They weren't even human. Culture just came out of the void. I remember clicking on some site full of jokes, and some of the jokes on the site I already knew, and I remember that feeling. None of this was created by anyone. It was all just here to begin with.
Yeah, so Ruben shared with us this interview for what magazine was it? Bomb magazine or something?
Apparently.
Yeah, with Joshua Cohen, and he had a lot to say about a lot of the themes that we're, I guess, dealing with here that I found really interesting. Ruben and I agree that, and I don't know if Rio has encountered much Joshua Cohen, but we agree that he's a very good.
Heard of him before.
He's a very good
on this podcast that I'm happy to say.
He's a very good commentator on the internet on how that.
He definitely came across as a wanker, which is not necessary.
Oh, God,
yeah.
Perfect wanker. Absolutely.
You know that my sister is actually based on the girl and the social network is actually based on my sister. Oh, and also I don't use social media.
He totally does. Like, I bet he has a secret
oh my God.
account.
Probably.
And I bet it's some like I bet it's a big account too, and like it's an anonymous like.
Wasn't Jonathan Franzen supposed to have a anonymous Twitter account? Wasn't that a thing for a few years?
No, I didn't know that.
It's like Lord's hot wings account.
Or
Tell us about this. I don't know about this. Lord's Hot Wings account.
Oh yeah, so she had like a Twitter account where she reviewed hot wings, like at every like fast food shop that she went to. People traced it because when she was on tour, she would be reviewing it in the city that she was on tour at, and then people realized, oh, it's Lord. And then as soon as people realized it was Lord, it was deleted.
Wow.
Speaking of favorite anonymous Twitter accounts, though, we have at some point in this podcast we have to talk about PR Guy 17. I want the cottage industry about who PR Guy 17
All right,
is.
you need to explain who this is for international people or even people interstate, because I think this is a very Victorian.
It's a very Victorian thing. Okay, well, we'll definitely have a link to him in the podcast notes. But
it's actually a her.
Is it? Well, who knows? I mean,
the person behind PR Guide 17.
It's PR them actually.
Yeah. Yeah, don't forget, we can't misgender.
It's Demi Lovato.
Is this Twitter account who is basically the biggest shill for Dan Andrews you've ever met in your entire life. But it's getting increasingly more and more like it's spinning Hendrix over here. It's just Spinoza maybe. It's just getting entirely more and more trying to spin their way out of everything that Dan Andrews does wrong. It's
and
so good.
Dan Andrews being the Premier of Victoria and which capital city is
Dictator Dan for people on this podcast.
Dictator Dan, which is the world's longest lockdown in the world.
That's right. We love being dominated.
Yeah.
Victoria.
And PR Guy 17 is Twitter account that is essentially, I feel like Ruben said, it's a shill and anonymous, so you don't know who it is. They've got a picture of Troy McClure from The Simpsons as their PFP.
That's the most infuriating part about it. Like every time I see the fucking image.
PDP?
Yeah, their display picture, aka.
Why did I say PFP?
I don't know. No, you can say that. I just love to correct people.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, it's Troy McClure, and they're always like spinning like every little thing the Premier does, however draconian, they're spinning it as like, oh, this is great, blah 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 blah. It's like they're essentially
they're a spin doctor,
Goebbels with Troy McClure's face.
Yeah. But it's my favorite one so far was like recently, where like this isn't even like me exaggerating. There's a tweet where he and of course he's not just like some random person. Like he's got like a large following as well. He'll like reply to like one of Andrew's tweets, like a VicGov Department of Health tweet, and he'll get like 1,000 likes or something like that. So he's popular. Sort of he channels like all the Dan drips on Twitter, basically. I think it's like a big puddle of drip. And my favorite tweet so far was one from like last week or something, or a few days ago, where he literally says that anyone who breaks the rules should be considered as murderers. You see that? Like, okay, go outside after 9 o'clock.
I wonder, like, do you
be
think,
charged for murder? Like,
if this person wasn't anonymous, I've not heard of PR they them 17 until this podcast, but I
Yes,
wonder,
Rio. Yes, bring it back to the topic. Yes.
would they have ever like gained as much notoriety as they could have? Were they known?
I think you're right. I think the fact that people don't know who it is and are trying to sort of guess that, okay, surely it must be someone in the, like, I think the consensus is that it's either someone in the actual government themselves, or it's just someone else. I can't. I mean, I don't think it's someone in the government. I think that
no, it can't be someone in the government, because I'm sure half the Labour Party fucking hates Daniel Andrews too. And
where were we?
So Joshua Cohen, in this interview anyway, he talks about near the end of his book, like Book of Numbers, is this big scene where he talks about the publishing industry and the Frankfurt publishing festival, or whatever it's called. Anyway, and he talks about the ways in which we're sort of stripped from our immediate sort of materiality of the world, but it's also become sort of like this artificial reality. You know, in this interview, like near the end, I won't read all of this, but I'll read some of it. He says that we're living in the reality show version of reality, is why, and we've been living in it for a while now. The story behind the story has become the only tale to tell. It's about transparency and disabuse. The democratization of the hero, or the hero's devaluation into celebrity, the seemingly American sense that there's a system in a place, an equal opportunity system by which anyone can claim the world's attention. Art is now concerned with figuring that out, with laying bare or appearing to lay bare the processes by which the people we read about or watch or listen to become themselves, so that we can have what they have too. Everyone gets a turn in this strange collaboration between insatiability and fairness. And then he goes on to say, if I was going to write another book, I was going to have to deal with this phenomenon. And he talks about the internet. Like, meanwhile, critics and even some novelists kept saying that fiction had gotten boring, without realizing that they'd gotten bored of themselves, of lives reloading email perpetually. The novel was dusty, fusty, artificial. That's what they said. But honestly, what wouldn't seem that way when compared to the effortless interface of identical screens? What handmade, circumscribed thing wouldn't seem crude next to a seemingly bottomless box of sleek titanium? Some people decided the answer was to write a memoir. Some people decided the answer was to write a memoir but then market it as fiction. They used themselves as narrators, using their own names. They used their own lives as plots and even their anxieties about using them. Only truth could save the form. Only truth could redeem the language and make it relevant to the accuracy manias of technology and media. I found this ridiculous, of course, and fertile. Better to be a ghostwriter of a ghostwriter. That's, I think, where like Cohen's intersection is here in this point. Like for Cohen, and this novel that he's talking about, Book of Numbers, the main joke of the novel is the narrator is called Joshua Cohen, who's ghostwriting effectively a Steve Jobs, Bill Gates type figure called Joshua Cohen. And the main joke is that at the beginning of the book, when he tries to Google his name, he comes up like 14th or on the 14th page or something like that. And this other guy, the Joshua Cohen of the internet, comes up number 1, and he's sort of like pissed off about that. So that's the sort of premise of the novel. And it becomes like very obvious that, you read the first page and it's like, this is obviously not Joshua Cohen, the novelist. And that in the age of Google, when you can Google your own name, the specificity and the individuality of your own name loses all meaning. Like the name is dead. That's what the death of the author is, right? It's the death of authorial intention, the death of your name meaning anything significant. Your name is literally just your name is only given meaning by the value that it's given by its societal value. So, you're more meaningful. Your name is more meaningful by how much clicks you get, how many likes you get, so on and so forth. But that then becomes that gets reproduced by the accuracy manias of technology, where you must be yourself all the time, every time, and if you're not, then something bad could happen to you, I guess. You're always being watched, you're always being surveilled, usually for someone else's profit, I guess, is the main concern there.
He's also said, I think in that same interview, he said that the study of literature is becoming a study of data. So when he's talking about, and I think he does talk about what we were talking about before, where people are just constantly trying to find out, like, the author of things. Like, there's all sorts of applications and stuff you can use, and that's probably how some people worked out Elena Ferrante and things like that, like stylometric kind of apps and all that sort of shit. And
he talks about how the deconstructionist idea, which I feel is not really deconstructionist, but anyway, that it's more of a Freudian or neo-Freudian idea, that like a writer is always betrayed by their unconscious tics or whatever. So, like, if I think his example is like, you can map all the ways Dickens talk about people's feet or whatever, and we can assume that, okay, maybe Dickens had a foot fetish or something like that, right? And that
honestly,
you're always betrayed by like your unconscious biases or whatever. But of course, like Cohen's point, I think in the novel as well, there are so many. He's self-conscious of the fact that you can actually do that. Mm-hmm. So like it circumvents that to a certain extent. Which I think is the power. In another place as well, he talks about how the novel itself should become in its anonymity as a cultural form, which it effectively is now. No one really reads them anymore. It should become a place of secrets and of the sacred, right? So he talks about how with the advent of the internet, such things as like secret cults, just anything to do with like the secret in terms of like the way that you might get initiated into a society only being available to certain people and certain sects is like sort of demolished, right? All information is available all the time. And that idea of secrecy is sort of gone as the way that it's aligned with anonymity. Mm-hmm. The novel for him should like be a space for that secret. Like, what better place to hide a secret than in a novel that no one's going to read? And that's what the novel should be sort of become about. It should become about the dangerous, the transgressive, and stuff like that, rather than the true or the self. Right? That's his gambit, I guess.
And I think something that he's getting at there as well is that the writing that goes on, and this is something that he does talk about a lot, is that the writing that goes on in the digital sphere is, I guess, of a different quality to what you would get in a novel. And I thought about this when sometimes I like to do when I'm a little bit drunk or baked or something. I like to do
unlike now.
Yes, unlike now. I like to do little experiments with have you guys ever used or heard of Grammarly?
Yes.
The like
YouTube won't let me not
write better with Grammarly. So I downloaded it and I use it. I get like classic authors or stories or whatever, and I put it into it and see what it suggests. And the two main ones which I really enjoyed were, I put in, because if you don't know, Grammarly is this thing that just it's basically like a more high level spell check, to sort of make sure that which in itself is very interesting, because I think what it actually does it is like flattens the foibles of like the way you write things. But anyway, I put in like Joyce. But also I went the other way and also put in like some pulp writers. Like I put in Lovecraft, and there was so much red, so much red in both. So I'm like, what's really interesting about that is that we talked about this. There's this sort of like flattening of style, and here is a good example of how it's sort of computerized, and not just in like Grammarly, but also in spell check. And like I'm sure if you put both of these authors in spell check, you would get a sea of red as well. And what's interesting about this is that, and I do run the risk of sounding like a kind of Luddite or Ted Kaczynski fucking net dystopian or something. But the fact is that this makes the writing less human.
Mm-hmm.
The style of a Joyce or someone like that, that's in their kind of inconsistencies or in their bending of the language. And it's almost like internet or digital writing or whatever you want to call it, like it brings it back into line and straightens it. Like it becomes rigid.
Yeah.
But at the same time, on social media, you get a lot of sort of kind of a folk style on social media that sort of plays with language a lot.
Absolutely.
Like one of the things, and I've complained about this in previous podcasts when like Rio has said aloud "umphy," which sounds stupid to me, and I feel stupid saying it, but it's just like there's the way that word evolved and is used is actually really playful and interesting, and it's cute, yeah. And but who authored that? No one authored that. That just sort of emerged spontaneously.
Well, in terms of like, I guess one of the things that's really strange about, maybe not that strange about Facebook and just like general social media as well, is that people don't seem to be. In general, I think there's an idea that written discourse or written culture has to be stylized or has to be like perfect, right? You know, if we find a mistake in a newspaper or if we find a mistake in a book, that's like not intentional or whatever, like it becomes a joke almost, right? If you see a badly written sentence that becomes like really bad, like I'm thinking have you ever read the first sentence of Franzen's new novel?
No.
Oh my fucking god! It's one second, I do actually have it like here. It's quite possibly the worst first sentence of a novel I've ever read in my entire life, and it's like it puts you off immediately. This is gonna load.
Worse because functionally bad, or just like I guess I'll see.
Functionally bad. I don't know why this is not.
Are you going to read it?
I'm going to read it. I'm trying to load.
Will you read it? Are you really?
Give me one sec. But it's a perfect example of like a first like the idea, you know, of a first sentence that is to turn you on, not put you off, right? But here we go. So this is the first sentence. The sky, broken by the bare oaks and elms of New Prospect, was full of moist promise.
Ew.
Right? I mean, I don't like Franzen that much, but that is the worst first like opening of a novel I've read in a long time.
Okay, look.
It can't, and it's not. I think it's intentionally done like that as well. Yeah. But I don't know. But anyway, my point was to be that Facebook and Twitter and different kinds of social medias, you don't have that problem anymore. Whereas like written discourse used to be the domain of the published, used to be the domain of the barriers to publication, all sort of stuff, which would try to not in the same way that, you know, things like Grammarly sort of like try to flatten language, but could be at the behest of editors and so on and so forth. In a weird way, social media does kind of like, it allows people to be themselves at the level of written language. Like they don't give a shit, like bogans, whatever the fuck, you know, dodgy aunties, they don't give a shit about the way they speak, on the way they write the way they speak, right?
Yeah.
And they're not like worried or concerned about someone being like, fuck you, can you please, you know, use correct English? So it's like, well, fuck you, right? And I think that's an interesting phenomena as well. And I don't know if this is good or bad, because I feel like it's also maybe contributing to the fact that language is also becoming slightly less interesting as well. I don't know how that relates to anonymity, but someone can probably connect it back up.
How do I connect that to anonymity?
Well, like,
well, actually, no. Here's an idea, right? So, I don't know if anyone's ever written a email recently, but if you write emails, the amount of times that you'll get like you try and like write one or two words, and then you get like a string of like 6 or 7 words being like, you can finish your email this way, and it tries to predict what you're going to write before you've even written the words. Now that's weird in a number of ways. But I think the anonymity here is the like ghost in the machine, right? And that's another like, we're not talking about just Joshua Cohen here, but another sort of point from his novel is that, and the reason why he thinks through about ghostwriters is the ways in which algorithms themselves sort of are ghostwriters on the internet, right? And that people sort of, and this comes back to this sort of idea of like language controlling people's consciousness rather than intentional actions, that people lose control of their language by the fact that algorithms will try to tell you what to do, and that has become, and that the people who have charge of that are basically anonymous to who you are as a person, and that you become in a certain way stripped of your own identity. In that sense, you lose part of your individuality as part of the trade for being seamless, for being accurate, I guess.
Yeah, like, and that goes back to the idea that we're sort of, we're all authors on the internet, but at the same time, there's this weird thing that happens with language where authorship itself is kind of distributed in a way that functionally, like, it's the same as anonymity. Mm-hmm. So, like, I'm going back to the horrible word which I hate saying that Rio says a lot, which is on fee. Okay, like no one owns that, but
don't say that, Mark.
But like no one owns that, but like there's a sort of it originated as an abbreviation, one of my followers, right? So OOMF, and then it became Umphy. like there was this experimentation with the language that wasn't from a particular author's style, but it was a kind of like I said, a kind of folk distributed thing that becomes a style, and which is why I kind of mentioned the Grammarly thing and Lovecraft and Joyce, in that what the software does is it flattens the style into something that doesn't resemble what makes the original authors great. But at the same time, you have all of this interesting kind of play with language, with stuff that doesn't really belong to anyone. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really interesting kind of tension that, and it does relate to anonymity in a way, because who owns this? Because style is often redounds to an individual. Like an individual is using words, sorry. God, I'm so drunk. Using words in a particular way. Whereas this kind of more distributed style that's kind of common in the internet, on the internet, is doing similar things, but it's not in the same way. Like no one owns it. And in that sense, it is anonymous functionally.
Well, it's the way that internet culture sort of just generally works, right? It's meme culture, right? It's TikTok culture, right? Where you don't try to be like wholly original. You try to be original within a context of different other memes, right? You just use the same template to try and achieve a new or different effect, to try and get as many clicks as possible, right? And that becomes like why a certain thing becomes like niche or becomes mainstream or becomes a sort of meme is sort of, who really knows? There's sort of more freedom there. No one really owns any particular like thing on TikTok or meme or whatever, right? But I think that there's a certain idea that maybe it's democratizing, but I think it also comes back to like this weird faux idea that everyone has a voice, that everyone's voice is meaningful, that everyone should be listened to, that everyone should be all those sort of different things, and it betrays the fact, the idea that everyone's subjectivity is worth the same is some sort of fundamental level, which is bullshit, right? It's utterly bullshit. Or that you're born with subjectivity, you're born with individual identity, when the opposite's true. You achieve subjectivity. Like the poets were right here. Like when Shelley talks about having a second birth into poetry, you're not given a birth into poetry. You have to earn it. You have to make your way into it in some sort of way, which is, I think, a more fundamentally democratic idea.
I
in the
feel like
reverse.
poetry is an afterbirth. It's like some sloppy like placenta that falls out of your pussy. Like
Basically, right? That's all poetry is, right? But the point being, right, that's actually framing it like that, I think, is actually more democratic in a certain way, because it means that you have to, well, it's more meritocratic anyway, right? You're not born with an individual identity, you have to achieve it. It's something you earn rather than something you're given by dint of the fact that you get born into a certain kind of family or whatever. But I don't think people particularly, it's this tension that like democracy like will always sort of have between like voice that at the end of the day, well, it's the tension of like free speech as well, right? So there's the American idea of free speech where like everyone should have the freedom to say whatever they want, right? And there's a sort of more European idea where like, well, an elected, sort of not an elected, but a sort of an elect few should have the right to censor certain kinds of speech because they'll do more general societal damage. That, you know, speech is something you earn, and so there's always that tension between those two things. And that I think anonymity, in a weird way, this is what we were sort of talking about earlier about the way that if you're anonymous, you can speak more truth to power. We think that in a democracy, being anonymous is not something that you actually need anymore. Like that anonymity is something that can only be valuable in a authoritarian, like fascist state, where you need that hiddenness to be able to speak truth to power. But that's just completely incorrect. If anything, anonymity is even more important in a democracy because it allows us to test boundaries. It allows us to be free to speak our minds. It allows us to be different from the majority.